The look on my mother's face when she realized what she'd done. I've replayed that moment more times than I can count, not out of cruelty, just because for 34 years I needed proof that the truth could finally catch up with a lie. She'd introduced me to my brother's future in-laws as the one who cleans offices. Not a housekeeper, not a cleaning professional, just the one who cleans offices, delivered with a small, apologetic laugh, like she was explaining away a stain on an otherwise spotless tablecloth. My brother didn't say a word. The man who would become his father-in-law, a retired federal judge named Hartwell, tilted his head and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not pity, something more careful than that. I smiled and said it was nice to meet him. That was 8 months before the rehearsal dinner. 8 months before everything came apart in the worst possible way, which also happened to be the only way that could have worked. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the part that came before it. I am 34 years old. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the older of 2 children, and from the time I was about 12 it was clear that my brother Theo was the one my parents had been waiting for. Not in a cruel way, at least, not at first. He was just easier, funnier. Better at the things they understood, like football and making people laugh at dinner. I was quiet, I read a lot. I got good grades that my mother called fine and my father called expected. When Theo got a C in algebra freshman year of high school, my father hired him a tutor and told him the important thing was effort. When I got a B in AP chemistry junior year, my mother said I should probably think about what I actually wanted to do with my life, because college wasn't guaranteed for everyone. I didn't say anything. I got a scholarship and went anyway. I studied accounting, then went back for my MBA, then spent 6 years doing forensic financial work for a mid-sized firm in Cincinnati, before a former professor connected me with a private equity group that was looking for someone to run their internal audit division. I moved back to Columbus 3 years ago, partly because the cost of living made sense and partly, if I'm being honest, because I was tired of being invisible to people who weren't even looking. I don't own a cleaning company. I never cleaned offices professionally in my life, though I have, like most people who live alone, cleaned my own home. What I do own is a small commercial building in the short north that I bought 4 years ago when the market briefly dipped, renovated on nights and weekends with a contractor friend, and rent out to a gallery and 2 boutiques. I also have a stake, a significant one it turned out, in a commercial property management company that a college friend started and that has, over the past 5 years, grown considerably. I am not wealthy by the standards of people who own yachts, but I am, by any reasonable measure, doing fine. My parents didn't know any of this, not because I hid it exactly, but because they never asked. When I came home for the holidays, my mother talked about Theo. When I mentioned work, she nodded with the expression people wear when they're waiting for you to finish. I stopped mentioning work. I stopped talking about the building. I let their version of me calcify because correcting it required energy I'd stopped having. Theo met Courtney at a work conference in Phoenix 3 years ago. Courtney is smart, warm, and very close with her family, especially her father, Judge Hartwell, who had served 2 decades on the federal bench in Virginia before retiring to spend time on his second passion, which was, of all things, commercial real estate investment. I didn't know that last part when I shook his hand at the engagement party. The engagement party was at my parents' house in Hilliard, a 3-bedroom colonial that smells like the same laundry detergent it always has, with the same family photos on the wall that have been there since 2003. Courtney's family drove up from Virginia. They were gracious and warm and clearly puzzled by the way my parents spoke to me, though they were too polite to show it. My mother introduced me to Courtney's mother Linda by saying, "And this is Theo's older sister. She's always been our independent one." A pause. "She cleans offices over in Cincinnati." Linda said that sounded like honest work because Linda was a kind person. My mother laughed and said, "Well, someone has to do it." I watched Judge Hartwell's eyes move to my face. I kept my expression neutral. I'd had years of practice. Later, when the party had thinned out and Theo was in the kitchen with my father, Judge Hartwell found me on the back porch with a glass of wine. "What kind of offices?" he said. I looked at him. "The cleaning," he said. "Residential, commercial? Do you specialize?" There was nothing unkind in the question. He genuinely wanted to know, or he wanted to know what I'd do with it. "I actually work in private equity," I said. "Internal audit. I also manage a small commercial property in the short north." He was quiet for a moment. "Which one?" I told him the address. He set his glass down on the porch railing and looked at me with an entirely different expression than before. My firm looked at that block 2 years ago, he said. We almost made a move on the corner unit. The comps were. He stopped. You own that building? I do. He looked back at the house, where my mother was laughing at something through the kitchen window. Does she know that? She knows what she knows, I said. He nodded slowly, the way men do when they've understood something they weren't expecting to understand. The months between the engagement party and the rehearsal dinner were, from the outside, unremarkable. I went to work. I managed my property. I had the occasional dinner with friends and the occasional Sunday call with my parents, during which my mother asked about Theo's plans and whether I was seeing anyone, and reminded me that I wasn't getting younger. What I didn't know was that Judge Hartwell had, in that time, done what men like him tend to do when they encounter an interesting variable. He looked into it. I found out later, much later, after everything had settled, that he'd had his assistant pull the ownership records on my building, that he'd looked up my professional history, that he'd mentioned my name to a colleague who worked in rehearsals and gotten back, in his words, a very interesting picture. I didn't know any of this at the rehearsal dinner. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant called Brennan's Table, a private event space in Grandview Heights that Courtney's family had reserved months in advance. It was elegant in a way my parents found both impressive and slightly threatening. White linens, tasting menu, a sommelier who asked everyone's preferences before the wine was poured. My mother arrived in the blue dress she'd bought for Theo's college graduation. My father wore the tie I'd given him for Christmas 4 years ago. They looked, in the way of people who are trying, like they were trying. I sat at the end of the table assigned to family, not the head, not the center, just the end. The seat next to me was empty for the first 20 minutes, and then Judge Hartwell sat down in it and asked if I minded. Not at all, I said. He ordered the same wine I'd ordered. We talked about the short north, about commercial vacancy rates, about a development project on the east side that was drawing mixed reactions from neighborhood groups. My mother, 2 seats down, glanced over twice with an expression I couldn't name. Something between confusion and irritation, the face she made when a conversation was happening that she hadn't initiated. Courtney's mother leaned across the table at one point and said to my mother, "Your daughter is fascinating. We had no idea she was in commercial real estate." My mother blinked. "She's in accounting," she said, which was the closest she'd ever come to acknowledging what I did. "She owns the Delancey building," Judge Hartwell said, in the same matter-of-fact tone he'd probably used to read verdicts. "Corner of 4th and Delancey. We've had our eye on that block for 2 years. My mother looked at me. I looked back. I didn't say anything because I didn't need to. The silence was doing all the work. Here is the part I have to explain carefully, because it's the part that people get wrong when they hear this story. I was not trying to humiliate my mother. What happened next was not something I planned or engineered or orchestrated from some position of wounded triumph. I had not come to that dinner with an agenda. I had come because Theo was my brother and Courtney was going to be my sister-in-law, and I loved them both and wanted to be there. What I had done, the only thing I had done, was stopped apologizing for who I was. That sounds simple, it wasn't. For most of my adult life, I had managed my parents' reality for them. I'd softened my accomplishments into vague references to work and a little project I'm involved with. I'd let my mother's version of me stand because correcting it felt like starting a war over territory I'd already evacuated. I'd learned to exist in my own family the way water learns to move around a stone, not because the stone is right, but because moving around it is easier than the argument. What I'd stopped doing, somewhere in the past 2 years, so gradually I hadn't noticed it happening, was hiding. I hadn't told them about the building, but I'd stopped denying it. I'd stopped steering the conversation away. I'd just let the truth exist in the room without a chaperone. And in that restaurant, with a federal judge describing my property portfolio across the white linens of my brother's rehearsal dinner, the truth had found its own way in. My mother excused herself after the salad course. I didn't follow her. Theo caught my eye from across the table. He had the expression he'd worn since childhood when something was happening around him that he didn't fully understand, a kind of careful blankness, like a stage curtain that has been pulled down very quickly. I gave him a small nod. He looked away. My father was talking to Courtney's uncle about Ohio State, and I don't think he fully registered what had happened. He was like that, present at the surface, elsewhere underneath. Linda found me in the hallway after dinner when people were gathering their coats. "I hope tonight wasn't uncomfortable," she said. It wasn't, I said, or it was, but not in a bad way. Sometimes things need to be uncomfortable for them to move. She squeezed my hand. Courtney adores you, you know. She talks about you. She's easy to love, I said, and I meant it. My mother called me 2 days after the rehearsal dinner. I was at my desk reviewing a lease renewal agreement when my phone lit up with her name. I let it ring twice before I picked up. You could have told us, she said. Not hello. Not how are you. Just that. Told you what? I asked, though I knew. About the building. About all of it. Your father looked it up. The property records. A pause that had a particular shape to it, the shape of someone trying to decide which direction to be heard in. We didn't know. I know you didn't, I said. Why didn't you tell us? I thought about it. Not the performance of thinking about it, actually thinking about it, because the question deserved that. Because you never asked, I said. And because every time I tried to talk about my life, the conversation moved on. Silence. That's not fair, she said. Maybe not, I said. But it's true. Another silence, longer. Judge Hartwell called your father this morning, she said. He wants to. They're interested in some kind of partnership. On the short north block. She said it like a confession. Like it cost her something to say it out loud. I know, I said. He emailed me last night. She exhaled. There are moments in a relationship, any relationship, but especially the ones that have been running the longest, when the architecture shifts. Not dramatically, not with a crack or a crash, just a slow, almost imperceptible redistribution of weight. I felt it then, in the silence between her exhale and whatever was going to come next. I didn't know, she said again, and this time it wasn't accusations. It was just something she needed to say, maybe to herself as much as to me. I know, I said. Theo's wedding was in September, at a vineyard outside of Grandview that Courtney's family had rented for the weekend. It was the kind of day that Ohio occasionally produces in the early fall, clear and cool, the light cutting sideways through the trees, the air smelling like cut grass and something faintly sweet. I walked Theo down the aisle alongside my mother, which was not the original plan. The original plan had been for my parents to walk him down together, but 2 weeks before the wedding, my father had a minor cardiac event that left him able to attend but not to walk distances, and Theo had asked me to step in. My mother stood on his other side. We didn't speak much, the three of us, as we walked, but I felt her hand find my arm at some point, and I let it stay there. The ceremony was brief and genuine. Courtney cried. Theo, who had not cried publicly since he was 7 years old, cried. Judge Hartwell, in the front row, pressed his lips together in the way of a man who is not going to cry in public, but is making no promises. During the reception, a woman I didn't recognize came up to me while I was standing near the bar with a glass of sparkling water. She was in her 50s, well-dressed, with the particular efficiency of movement that belongs to people who run things. You're Theo's sister, she said. I am, I said. I'm Margot. I'm on the board of the Short North Alliance. She tilted her head. I understand you own the Delancey block. I said that I did. We've been trying to get the owner to the table for 2 years, she said. Every time we reach out, we get a property management company. That's how I prefer it, I said. She laughed, a real laugh, surprised. Of course you do. She handed me her card. When you're ready to have a different kind of conversation, I'd like to be part of it. I took the card. Across the room, I could see my mother watching us. I couldn't read her expression from that distance. It was too far and the light was angled wrong. But she was watching. The partnership with Judge Hartwell's group took 4 months to structure. It was not my first commercial deal, but it was the most complex, and there were moments during the negotiation where I lay awake at 2 a.m. running numbers in my head, second-guessing terms, trying to separate the business logic from the personal significance I kept trying not to attach to it. In the end, the deal was straightforward. His firm brought capital and connections. I brought the asset and operational knowledge. We agreed on a phased development plan that would expand the building's footprint while keeping the existing tenants in place, something I'd insisted on as a non-negotiable. Because those businesses had been with me since the beginning and I wasn't the kind of owner who rewarded loyalty with displacement. Judge Hartwell signed the final documents at my office on a Wednesday morning in January. You're good at this, he said afterward. I had a lot of time to practice, I said. He looked at me with that careful expression he'd had the first night on my parents' back porch. Your mother called Linda last month, he said. Did you know that? I didn't. She said she wanted to apologize for the way she'd introduced you at the engagement party. He paused. Linda said she cried. I looked out the window at the street below, which was gray and wet with January slush, a delivery truck idling at the corner. That must have been hard for her, I said. It probably was, he said. She also said she was proud of you. In case you were wondering. I had been wondering, I realized. I just hadn't known it. My mother and I have dinner every few weeks now. Not always comfortably. There are still silences that have more in them than either of us knows how to say. And there are still moments when she reverts to a version of the dynamic I grew up inside, and I have to decide in real time whether to let it pass or to push back gently. I usually push back gently. She usually doesn't like it. But she listens, that's new. Last month, she came to the Short North to see the building for the first time. I walked her through the gallery on the ground floor and introduced her to the owner, who recognized my mother's last name and said, "Oh, you must be so proud. Your daughter has been the best landlord we've ever had." My mother stood in the middle of the gallery with its white walls and good light and the art I've been looking at for 3 years, and something crossed her face that I hadn't seen there in a very long time. "I am," she said. "I really am." I didn't make a big thing of it. I bought her a coffee from the cafe next door, and we walked along the street in the November cold and talked about Theo and Courtney, who are expecting their first child in the spring, and about my father's recovery, which is going better than the cardiologist expected, and about a pottery class she's been thinking about taking. It wasn't a resolution exactly. It wasn't a clean ending with a bow on it. It was just two people walking, trying to find a language they hadn't quite learned yet, in a neighborhood where I had quietly built something real while no one who was supposed to see it was looking. That's enough. For now, it's enough.